Before anyone gets confused, no, this is not a video on the worst Star Wars characters. That will come at a later date if you guys are interested. We're going to do the most hateable characters today, and I'm not talking hateable by standards of Backlash, so don't expect me to go, duh, Rey, duh, Reva. Nah, we're not doing that. I have standards. We're gonna do characters that are meant to be intentionally hated, and most can agree are pretty bad people. That's not to say any of these characters are poorly written, quite the opposite. I love pretty much all of the characters on this list. So, without further stalling, let's look at some of the most detestable characters in all of Star Wars.
Oh no, he's hot!
Number 10 is Admiral Rampart from the Bad Batch. Honestly, compared to other Imperial officers, Rampart isn't nearly as bad, but there's something that annoys me on a deep level with him. But before we get to that, let's get these other crappy things out of the way. First, he destroys Kamino, which honestly wasn't his idea and something he was ordered to do, but he still carried it out. Next, he killed Captain Wilco after the clone reasonably didn't want to lie on a report. This was so uncalled for on so many levels that it cemented Rampart for me as a grade A asshat. After that, he tried to cover up the Kamino bombing by assassinating Senator Chuchi, but he fails and goes to jail for it. Now, all of that was bad, but it's your typical Imperial stuff. It's nothing special compared to Tarkin or General Hux, who destroyed entire planets. What annoys me the most with Rampart is how he had so many opportunities to change for the better, and he just decides to ignore every chance he had and doubled down. The Bad Batch rescued him in Season 3, and he just refuses to take the opportunity to redeem himself. He makes every wrong decision that could be possible, and digging a deeper hole each time, only for it to get himself killed at the end. All of it could have been avoided if he had just had the chance to self-reflect, but his greed got the better of him every step of the way.
Say what again? Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you, motherfucker.
Number 9 may prove to be controversial, but I chose Mace Windu. I know a lot of people think Mace is cool, and I agree. Samuel Jackson is a badass, he's got a purple lightsaber, he has some cool one-liners, but that doesn't deny the fact that he's a representation of what the Jedi shouldn't be. He's overly neglectful of Anakin Skywalker, knowing that he's sensitive and quick to anger, and while yes, Anakin's behavior isn't acceptable either, Mace shouldn't be poking the bear. A Jedi's job is to keep the peace, so why would he needlessly escalate a situation where Anakin's upset? If the guy bothered to have a grown-up conversation with Anakin, he could have prevented Anakin's turn, given that his distrust of the Council is one of the reasons to betray them. Remember when he refused to apologize to Ahsoka after shunting her and blaming her for bombing the Jedi Temple, and he chalks it up to will of the Force rather than take responsibility? Not to mention he's overly passive-aggressive toward her after she left? Remember when he murdered Jango Fett, and whether or not you want to argue if it was warranted or not, he still refused to take responsibility after Boba Fett confessed that he made the wrong decision to seek vengeance, but he still wouldn't forgive Mace. Remember what Mace said to him after that?
I'll never forgive you.
Well, you're going to have to.
Newsflash, asshole. This frightened and misguided child does not have to forgive you for decapitating his father in front of him. You having a valid reason to do so is irrelevant. You still traumatized a child in a position he should not have been in. Own up to it.
I will kill your wife. I will kill your son.
Number 8 is Moff Gideon. While I don't find the conclusion to this character's story to be all that satisfying, Gideon had a fairly consistent personality throughout all of The Mandalorian, the personality in question being an asshole. Gideon is the textbook definition of entitlement, someone who he believes is not worth being at the bottom of the food chain. From his very first appearance, we are shown that he considers not only his opponents, but his peers and troopers to be disposable pawns on a chessboard, and the child he's been pursuing is just a trophy in his eyes. We also learn that he flaunts his lack of nobility and honor because, in his own words,
I will act in my own self-interest.
betrayal is a classic staple when it comes to bad guys, but it's so common with Moff Gideon that by the time we get to Season 3, the heroes don't even bother reasoning with him when the opportunity arises. Circling back to Gideon's entitlement, he truly believes that he's the perfect candidate to not only rule the galaxy and snub Thrawn if he ever returned, but he's the prime template for his own clone army. You know how Darth Sidious sought out the galaxy's best bounty hunter to be the template for his clone army? Gideon just threw that out the window and said, nah, I'm the perfect specimen, there's no one else. the crown jewel of which is when he decides to have his own army fitted with Mandalorian armor, a bastardization of their culture and the only remaining reminder of Mandalorians once he finishes wiping them all out.
I've heard these Voldemort rumors, and I, for one, simply don't believe it.
At number 7 is Senator Zono from Ahsoka. This character did debut in Star Wars Resistance, but he didn't really do much, so we're just going to focus on the younger portrayal of the character played by Nelson Lee. Zono is one of the few antagonists in Star Wars who feels like a real person. Not in the sense that he's sympathetic or has reasonable motivations like other bad guys, but he's a corrupt government leader. This is unfortunately how most real-world politicians act. They ignore red flags and prioritize their self-image. Zono was so cowardly to the point where he feared losing the peace he didn't even earn, and blatantly disregarded Imperial warlords because he couldn't be bothered to do his job, which caused the First Order to rise back to power. It's now the job for those who are considered treasonous, like Hera or Carson Teba, to step up and go against the system that failed them. Zono may not be our traditional bad guy, but he's incredibly similar to the villains of our real world.
You chose books. I chose looks.
At number 6 is Sid from The Bad Batch. At first, Sid started off as kind of annoying, but she at least had good intentions and seemed to be a good mentor for Omega. But as the show goes on, she's just needlessly aggressive. By episode 13, she just threatens the Batch to help her, and insinuates turning them into the Empire if they refuse. Then by season 2, she continues throwing them under the bus and flat out leaves them to die on a planet. When they call her out afterwards, she just sweeps it under the rug and doesn't take accountability. So the Bad Batch decide to leave Sid and just do their own thing. So what does Sid do? Continue to threaten their crew until they return. When they do end up returning after one of their team members dies, she then decides to turn them into the Empire, resulting in Omega getting kidnapped and being forced into indentured servitude for 7 months, the entire city being under Imperial occupation, and the Batch being left with nothing except critical injuries. What hurts even more is that I genuinely thought Sid was going to come around by the end and get a redemption arc, since that's something so common in Star Wars stories. But for once, they decided to have a character double down on their actions and just leave the story. I honestly appreciate the commitment to having the message be that sometimes you can't change a person's mind and you need to let them go. They're better off not being a part of your lives.
Horton hears domestic violence in the next apartment and doesn't call 911.
Number 5 is Perrin from Andor. I think it goes without saying that Perrin is probably the worst husband in Star Wars, and yes, that includes Anakin. He's so irrationally rude to Mon Mothma that it comes off as emotionally abusive at points. What I despise about Perrin the most is that he isn't even pro-Empire. I can at least appreciate him for going all the way when competing in the Prick Olympics, but he's not even a bootlicker. He's just apathetic towards everyone and everything. All he cares about is money and his own well-being. He invites his wife's political opponents to dinner knowing how much she despises them, and dismisses everything Mon has to say about the Empire's rule because she's just raving.
I've taken care of that. You're at the boring end of the table. These people are fun.
Your fun friends just cut off their shipping lanes yesterday. Do you know how many will starve?
Perhaps you should have a rest.
Perrin is just the epitome of a capitalist bigwig who refuses to get involved because he's too afraid to get his own hands dirty. What he's done to be detestable seems trivial compared to the other characters on the list, but man, this guy's just a piece of work when it comes to being a husband.
There's rumor you bought me a present. Must everything be boring and sad?
You're a stupid man! A stupid man!
Number 4 is our third character from The Bad Batch with Lieutenant Nolan. Nolan is only in one episode of the show, yet he's cemented his impact as one of the most despised Imperials in the franchise. You ask someone who their most hated Star Wars character is, it's probably gonna be him. For starters, Nolan just straight up dislikes clones, which already earns him a spot on this list. He flaunts a superiority complex throughout the episode, refuses to let the soldiers mourn their fallen friends, sends them out in harsh conditions to secure cargo, and when they return on the brink of death, Nolan lets one of them die and tells the other that he's expendable and his death is worthless in the grand scheme of things. So what does Crosshair do? Inflicts justice.
I am a surgeon!
And yet we have our fourth character from The Bad Batch with Dr. Hemlock at number 3. Nolan may be the most despised, but at least he died after one episode. I haven't seen a character people have wanted to die more than Hemlock. Ever since his debut in Season 2, he has had one of the most punchable faces in any Star Wars show. It's no secret that clones are the fan favorites in Star Wars, so seeing them be subjected to torture and experimentations at the hands of a mad doctor was an easy recipe for this guy to be utterly detestable. He refers to them as property, brainwashes them into drones to hunt down other clones, conducts experiments on children he actively placed bounties on for them to get kidnapped and separated from their families. Not to mention, he never lashes out. Hemlock always maintains that soft-spoken persona, and we never get to see the satisfaction of him breaking under pressure, no matter the situation. He will never give anyone an inch in knowing that they've irritated him. It takes until the finale for him to actively raise his voice and show any sign of fear, and it leads to one of the most satisfying deaths in the entire franchise.
Gotcha, bitch! Gotcha, bitch! Gotcha, bitch! Gotcha, bitch! Gotcha, bitch! Gotcha, bitch!
At number 2 is the grand schemer himself, Palpatine. Palpatine is so delightfully gleeful in his escapades that it makes him all the more fun to watch, albeit all the more hateable. Let's ignore the fact that he manipulated an entire war to be created, leading to the deaths of millions of people. Let's ignore that he played God and inadvertently created a being from the Force that he groomed to become his apprentice. Let's ignore the fact that he made himself a martyr to get himself elected as Chancellor, and manipulate the ones who helped him get into that position in the first place so he can get even more power. Let's ignore that he's thrown almost every single cohort he's gained under the bus for the sole purpose of getting even more allies he plans on stabbing in the back later on. Let's ignore all that to look at how Palpatine got away with committing mass ethnic cleansing on an entire religion of peacekeepers. People seem to miss the entire point of the Clone Wars. Its first purpose was to give Palpatine more power over the Senate. If a war had broken out, it would be a perfect excuse. The second purpose was to act as if they had no military to fight the threats forming, pushing the Jedi into a position to be soldiers, knowing it would negatively affect how the citizens of the Republic would view them. I'm not making excuses for the Jedi, they should not have gotten involved at all, but Palpatine being a master manipulator got his way. That was the goal of the Clone Wars. Villainize the peacekeepers. Once he kills them all, no one would care because no one will miss them. That's what makes Palpatine the pro-planner. He's always 3 steps ahead and has a fate for every person he's toying with.
I'm Mr. Frog.
And at number 1 is quite possibly the most maligned Star Wars character of all time, ex-Jedi Master Pong Krell. He was only in 4 episodes of the Clone Wars and has never appeared in any stories afterward, but the impact he left on fans was unforgettable to say the least. When we first met Krell, he was just kind of a prick and was rude to the clone troopers and doesn't consider their well-being, but it was all for the sake of the mission that they were on.
Quicken that pace, battalion. This isn't some training course on Camino.
Then you see how he talks to the clones face to face, and the man is just detestable, refusing to call the clones by their preferred names and instead using their clone numbers, which we know the clones hate, since we've spent so much time with them.
CT-7567, do you have a malfunction in your design? This entire operation has been compromised because of your failure!
He's overly aggressive, refuses to fight on the front lines while feeding the clones to the dogs, and when Fives and Jesse decide to go behind his back and do things differently and single-handedly save the day, Krell decides to accuse them of treason and have them executed. Now let's be fair for a minute. Fives and Jesse did disobey orders, but at worst they should have been written up or put on probation.
I can understand a court-martial and locking us up in the brig, but executing us?
And all of it, of course, capped off by him revealing to be a traitor who turns the clones against one another by telling both teams that the other is the enemy disguised as clones. He's demented. He genuinely believes the clones won't stand up to him because they're obligated to follow orders. He thinks he's untouchable and can do whatever he wants. It's what makes Rex's arc of learning to do what's right, and that being a soldier doesn't solely mean doing everything you're told to do, so satisfying. Because it's the character shedding that by-the-book exterior, all thanks to one of the most hateable characters in the entire Star Wars saga.
I will not be undermined by creatures bred in some laboratory.
So those are the most hateable characters in Star Wars, at least in my opinion. If you disagree, you can yell at me in the comments and give your own list. Just don't say Rey or Reva. Get creative, for God's sake. But aside from that, I will see you guys later.